A rooster crowed, its sharp cry slicing through the cold morning air of Eldermere. Smoke spiraled lazily from the chimneys of thatched cottages, mingling with the scent of damp earth and wildflowers. In a small forge tucked at the edge of the village, the rhythmic clang of a hammer echoed as Alric swung it against the glowing iron. Sparks leapt into the air, illuminating his sweat-streaked face. His father's voice cut through the noise, deep and steady. "Focus, Alric. A blade doesn't forge itself." Alric nodded, gripping the hammer tighter. His arms ached, but he ignored the burn, pouring his energy into each strike. Behind him, the forge's fire roared, casting flickering shadows on the stone walls. Outside, villagers bustled about, their chatter punctuated by the creak of wooden carts and the bleating of sheep. But Alric's world was confined to the glowing iron and the dream that burned brighter than the forge's flames. That evening, after the forge's fire had dimmed and the village settled into the quiet hum of twilight, Alric climbed the hill that overlooked Eldermere. The grass, cool and damp beneath his fingers, swayed gently in the breeze. He squinted into the distance, where the faint glimmer of armor caught the last rays of the setting sun. Knights rode past, their banners snapping in the wind. Alric's chest tightened as he watched them, his fingers curling into the grass. One day, he promised himself, he'd be among them. The forest loomed dark and silent as Alric ventured into its depths the next day, his hands clutching a worn axe. He scanned the underbrush for firewood, his ears straining for the snap of twigs or the rustle of leaves. But it wasn't the sound of animals that made him freeze. It was the groan, low, pained, and unmistakably human. He pushed through the brambles, heart pounding, until he found the source. A man lay slumped against a tree, his armor streaked with blood. The crest of King Davor gleamed faintly on his chestplate. Alric dropped his axe and knelt beside him. "Sir?" Alric's voice wavered. The knight's eyes fluttered open, their green depths clouded with pain. "Help me," the knight rasped, his voice barely audible. Without hesitation, Alric tore his cloak and pressed it against the wound. The knight winced but didn't protest. Minutes stretched into hours as Alric worked, fashioning a makeshift stretcher from fallen branches and vines. He heaved the knight onto it, his muscles screaming in protest, and began the long trek back to the village. By the time they reached Eldermere, Alric's legs felt like lead. Villagers gathered, their whispers filling the air, but Alric ignored them. He dragged the stretcher into his family's small home, where his mother's gentle hands took over. Together, they cleaned the knight's wounds and fed him broth. Days passed, and the knight's strength returned, his gratitude evident in the way his eyes softened when he looked at Alric. "You're no ordinary village boy," Sir Eadric said one morning, his voice steady for the first time since his arrival. "There's a fire in you. Come with me to Darenthall. I'll train you." Alric's heart raced, but he hesitated, glancing at his parents. His father's brow furrowed, and his mother's eyes shone with worry, but neither spoke. Finally, his father placed a heavy hand on Alric's shoulder. "Go," he said gruffly. "Forge your own path." The journey to Darenthall was nothing like Alric had imagined. The sky wept incessantly, each droplet striking his cloak like icy needles as they trudged through rain-soaked terrain. The dirt roads turned into rivers of mud, sucking at their boots with each step and threatening to pull them down into its grasp. Alric's arms ached from carrying their provisions, the weight feeling heavier with every mile. Yet, he pressed on, his resolve as unyielding as the mountain peaks in the distance. Sir Eadric rode ahead, his figure a stoic silhouette against the gray skies. "Stay vigilant, Alric," he called back, his voice cutting through the rhythm of the rain. The road to Darenthall is fraught with danger, and not all threats are natural. As if summoned by Eadric's warning, shadows flitted through the underbrush along the roadside. Alric's heart raced as he caught the glint of steel between the trees. Bandits. A group of them emerged from the thicket, their faces twisted into hungry sneers. One stepped forward, a burly man with a jagged scar across his cheek, brandishing a rusted blade. "Your coin, knight, or your life," the bandit growled. Eadric dismounted with the calm precision of a man who had faced death countless times. His hand rested on the hilt of his sword, and the air around him seemed to shift. "Stand aside," he commanded, his tone sharp enough to cut through stone. The bandits hesitated, their bravado faltering under Eadric's unyielding gaze. But one lunged forward, and the forest erupted into chaos. Alric barely had time to react before Eadric's blade sang through the air, its edge flashing like lightning. The knight moved with lethal grace, parrying blows and striking with precision. Alric stumbled backward, clutching a branch as a bandit lunged toward him. Instinct took over. He swung the branch with all his might, the impact sending vibrations up his arms as the bandit crumpled to the ground. When the skirmish ended, the bandits lay scattered, groaning or unconscious. Eadric cleaned his blade with a practiced motion, his expression unreadable. "Well done, boy," he said, casting a glance at Alric. "You've got the instincts, but instincts alone won't keep you alive." The rest of the journey was no less arduous. They passed through dense forests, where the air was thick with the scent of pine and damp earth. Eadric shared tales to distract them from the unrelenting rain. He spoke of battles waged on sunlit fields, of comrades lost and victories hard won. Alric hung on to every word, his imagination painting vivid pictures of knights charging into the fray, banners flying high. "War is not as noble as the ballads make it seem," Eadric warned one evening as they camped under a canopy of trees. The firelight danced across his weathered face. "It's bloody and cruel, but it reveals the truth of a man's character. Remember that, Alric." As the days passed, the landscape began to change. The forests thinned, giving way to rolling hills and bustling villages. Alric's legs burned with exhaustion, and blisters lined his hands, but his determination grew stronger with each passing mile. Finally, the towering walls of Darenthall came into view, their stone ramparts gleaming under the pale sunlight. Alric's breath caught as he beheld the grandeur of the city, a sprawling maze of cobbled streets, bustling markets, and spires that seemed to pierce the heavens. Eadric turned to him, a rare smile softening his features. "Welcome to Darenthall," he said. "Your real journey begins here." Darenthall was a marvel. Its towering walls seemed to touch the sky, and the castle spires gleamed in the sunlight. Alric's breath caught as they passed bustling markets where merchants hawked spices and silks, their voices a cacophony of accents and languages. But there was no time to linger. Sir Eadric led him straight to the castle, where Alric's life as a page began. The days were grueling. Alric's hands blistered from polishing armor and scrubbing floors, his muscles aching as he carried knights' weapons up steep staircases. Every task was a test of endurance, but the fire within him never dimmed. The noble-born pages laughed at him, their jests cutting sharper than any blade, but Alric bore their scorn in silence, his focus unshaken. When the castle quieted at night, Alric stole away to the courtyard. He gripped a wooden sword with raw, blistered hands, his strikes echoing in the stillness. Each swing carried his frustration, his determination, and his dreams of becoming more than a mere servant. Moonlight bathed the stones as he practiced until his arms trembled, and his legs could barely hold him. By day, Alric's duties took him to the Great Hall, where he found himself drawn to the war council meetings. At first he lingered at the edges, sweeping floors and setting out trays of food. But as the lords and knights unrolled maps and argued over strategies, his curiosity grew. He began to linger, his broom forgotten as he watched Sir Eadric and the other commanders point to rivers and ridges, discussing flanking maneuvers and supply lines. One evening, noticing Alric's rapt attention, Sir Eadric gestured for him to step closer. "What would you do here, boy?" he asked, pointing to a narrow pass on the map. The room fell silent, the lords exchanging skeptical glances. Alric swallowed hard, his mind racing. "I would station archers on the cliffs," he said, his voice steady despite his pounding heart. "If the enemy tries to push through, they'll be exposed from above." Eadric's eyes narrowed as he studied the map, then nodded. "A sound idea," he said. "Perhaps you've been paying attention after all." From then on, Alric was no longer merely an observer. Eadric began quizzing him on tactics, challenging him to think like a commander. Alric pored over dusty tomes in the library, memorizing battle formations and the accounts of legendary sieges. He traced maps with his fingers, imagining himself leading armies through valleys and over mountains. The pages mocked him less as his confidence grew, and though he still bore the brunt of the most menial tasks, he now carried himself with quiet determination. Every lesson, every grueling day, and every sleepless night brought Alric closer to his dream. The once timid boy from Eldermere was beginning to see the world not just as a servant, but as a strategist, a warrior in the making. In the courtyard of Darenthall, the sharp clash of blades rang out as Alric ducked under a swift strike. His opponent, a seasoned squire with a cocky grin, pressed forward, but Alric's movements were deliberate, his focus unshakable. Sweat dripped down his temple, but he ignored it, pivoting on his heel to deliver a strike that sent the squire's blade clattering to the ground. A low murmur rippled through the onlookers. Alric straightened, his chest rising and falling as he sheathed his sword. He caught the surprised glance of one knight, a man known for his disdain of common-born trainees, and allowed himself the smallest flicker of satisfaction. In the evenings, Alric sat by the flickering light of the library's candles, his fingers tracing the illustrations of battle formations in a worn tome. The words blurred as fatigue threatened to claim him, but he pressed on, his lips silently forming the names of legendary knights. Across the hall, other squires laughed and jested, their voices carrying the weight of noble lineage. But Alric's world was silent determination. Each page he turned a step closer to proving he belonged. Under Sir Eadric's watchful eye, his skills flourished. The older knight's corrections were sharp but fair, his approval rare but unmistakable in the way he clapped Alric on the shoulder after a well-fought bout. By the time Alric donned the armor of a squire, the forge-hardened boy from Eldermere had been replaced by a young warrior whose blade and mind carried the sharpness of tempered steel. The Siege of Blackthorn Keep was Alric's crucible. Standing atop a ridge, he surveyed the fortress, its stone walls battered but unyielding. The rebel lord within had repelled every assault, and the king's forces were weary. Alric's eyes narrowed as he traced the cliffs behind the keep, their jagged edges hidden in shadow. "We scale them," he said, his voice steady despite the murmurs of doubt from the men around him. Under the cover of darkness, Alric led a small group up the cliffs. The climb was treacherous, the wind biting at their exposed skin, but Alric's determination never wavered. By dawn, they reached the top, their breaths ragged but victorious. Slipping into the keep, they took the defenders by surprise, opening the gates for the king's army. The clamor of swords and the shouts of soldiers blended into a deafening cacophony as Alric plunged into the fray. He felt the jarring impact of steel meeting steel, each clash reverberating up his arm. His breaths came in sharp bursts, but his movements were fluid, honed by countless hours of practice. Alric's blade cut through the chaos, narrowly deflecting a blow aimed for his shoulder before spinning to deliver a swift counterstrike that sent his opponent sprawling. The ground beneath him was slick with mud and blood, and the air hung heavy with the tang of iron. He spotted a fellow soldier faltering under the weight of an enemy's assault. Without hesitation, Alric surged forward, intercepting the strike with a ringing parry and driving his opponent back with calculated ferocity. Amid the tumult, the tide began to turn. Alric led his unit with unyielding focus, signaling formations and shouting commands that cut through the din. His sword became an extension of his will, and for every fallen comrade, he exacted a swift and decisive retribution. When the battle's roar finally ebbed into an uneasy silence, Alric stood among the remnants of the fight, his chest heaving and his blade slick with blood. The sunlight broke through the dissipating smoke, and with it came the sound of boots crunching on the gravel-strewn ground. Alric turned to see King Davor approaching, his armor streaked but unbowed. The king's eyes, sharp and discerning, locked onto Alric, and a flicker of pride softened his stern expression. "Kneel," the king commanded, his voice carrying over the quiet field. "Rise, Sir Alric, Knight of Eldermere." The cheers of the soldiers rang in his ears as he stood, but Alric's thoughts drifted to the hill overlooking his village, where a boy had once dreamed of this very moment. Years later, clad in gleaming armor, Sir Alric returned to Eldermere. Children gathered around him, their eyes wide as he recounted tales of bravery and honor. He listened to their dreams, offering words of encouragement that echoed the ones Sir Eadric had once given him. The boy from Eldermere had become a legend, but he remained true to his roots, ensuring that others knew they too could rise, no matter how humble their beginnings.